So welcome to our 2025 CLM webinar series. This is the August installment, and we are going to be talking about records today. First, a few housekeeping things, some programs coming up that we wanted to mention. Our next CLM webinar in this series is coming in October. You can register at the link there to the left if you haven't already. We have a couple programs coming up that have to do with water quality. 2 field days. The first one is August 20th. That is our team's field day. Ditch the runoff is the theme, and we'll be covering 2-stage ditches and other EduField water quality practices. Attendance is limited for that event, so please register at the link here to the left if you're interested in attending. And then at the very bottom, we have a soil health and water management field day coming up just about a week later at the end of August, held at the OSU Lima campus. That's going to be, I think, an all-day event, super interesting and full of information. And that registration link is also there. I will make sure that those get put in the chat box as well. So today's webinar, like this entire series, is brought to you by the OSU Extension Water Quality Team. Here we have our current team listed. My name is Rachel Cochran. I'm the Water Quality Associate serving Paulding, Defiance, and Van Wert counties. And we're joined by the rest of the team here in the background who's going to help moderate today. Today's speakers, we have quite the lineup for you. We're going to start out with Ryan McMichael. He's the Ag and Natural Resources Educator with Mercer County Extension. Next up, we have Christine Pence. She is a DLEP inspector with the Ohio Department of Agriculture. And then wrapping things up today, we're going to hear from Dr. Manbir Rakkar, professor and state specialist in soil fertility from the Ohio State, about some research that's going on. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will turn it right over to Ryan.
So yeah, welcome everybody. So we're gonna get started here with crap happens. We need to make sure it's on the record. So as we think about this in terms of our manure record keeping, we're gonna go back and what are the basics that we need to have in there, and then what are some of the common kind of questions that come up, or maybe issues that kind of come up when we start to fill out those records, and what are some things that we need to see. So as we start to go through this here, just to kind of review those record keeping requirements. And so anytime you would go to make that application, that manure that we're putting on, it's treated as a fertilizer. It's got a guaranteed analysis. And so we follow those fertilizer manure record keeping requirements. We need to record the name of that individual who applied that fertilizer. And then, of course, if that's somebody different, we need to make sure that we put that name of that certificate holder on there, the one that's going to be responsible to make sure that that is done properly. So we have those informations. We go on to recording the date, have the month, the day, the year that we're putting on there. The location of where that application occurred. We'll get a question of, should that be the name of the farm that it was at, the field, if you call it the old Smith field, or should it be GPS coordinates? As long as you can go and to record that, and it can be, found again, as far as what that is, it's just to make sure to have that location, because if we have to go back to those records, that we can say, yes, then when we called it the old Smith field, that's where it was at. And then obviously our rate, how many pounds of are we putting on, or many times it's tons that we're looking at, or gallons that we might be putting on. And obviously, what is that method of application of fertilizer manure? Again, we talk about manure, looking at it as a fertilizer here, as where it comes in. The total area is applied, and then obviously the amount of fertilizer we put on total by the weight or the volume. All right, as we kind of go a little bit further, an analysis of that fertilizer, that manure, is recorded as well. The soil conditions, and we'll talk a little bit more about soil conditions, of what it was at that time of that application. And then what's really important, we look at those weather conditions, and then what's the forecast for the day following that application. And then, of course, if we're surface applying, to determine if that land, was it frozen or was it snow covered? And so when we think about this, one of the requirements right at the top there, within 24 hours of application, both all these requirements is, within your day that you're applying that manure, you need to record that 24 hours after you have made that application. It needs to be documented down. And I bring that up because, what if we have something like this? What if we have a bad day? You know, and as you go and you have an issue, probably on this of course instance, probably our soil conditions weren't appropriate to be out there to be applying, manure on there. But we think about this, and anything can go wrong when we're making those applications. As we said, crap happens, right? And so, what if we have this bad day and we forget to put that down in our records? And so really it says, we look at it as within 24 hours. When you go to start that application, you can go ahead and record that information down. However, you're going to, record that information to put that down. And then obviously if you need to, correct that at the end of the application that something got switched, you went to a different rate as you were going, you can do that. But that's going to be key is that you have that down. That way, when you do have something that maybe goes awry or you change, you won't forget to put that application down into your records, because that's a concern as we go and we have that information that we need to keep for 3 years. We need to make sure that we have that and can go back to it, because if we are inspected or if there is any kind of issues that do come from our manure applications, we need to be able to refer back to what we have written down. And obviously, if you accidentally forgot, if you did that, it doesn't fare well if you don't have those records that you can go back to. So, make sure that we have that, even though it says within 24 hours of application, we would recommend as a good practice would be as you start to make that application, you have that recorded. And then obviously, if you would need to say, hey, we changed this, or we did that, and it had to be changed, it could be. The law is, of course, within the 24 hours, but it would be good that you don't have something that comes up. The questions that we then would roll into is, what happens, the soil conditions. We look at here in Mercer County, we can have areas that, earlier this spring, we had an area that had 4 inches of rain in a very short time period, and you went just 3 miles away, and you had nothing. And in those conditions, even just in close proximity, can be very different soil conditions. All right. When you have to look about, applying on a crop, that can be very different as far as what we have in terms of a crop, especially as we get to after, harvest and before that kind of the restrictions apply. Is it a growing crop here or this, or, what actually is the percentages? And so we have those kind of things that come up that people have, what is saturated soil? How do we determine that? What kind of, how do you go and figure out, this is a growing crop or this was a dead crop? Where is that line? And another question we have is, where do you obtain weather conditions? Obviously, when we think about this, and this is shared from a picture from Glenn Arnold and information from our weather specialist, Aaron Wilson. It's fewer days that we have for field work and manure application. When we look at this field, it's obvious that that field is going to have soil conditions that are not suitable to have a manure application. The soil saturated, it's visually saturated, that you can see water to sit there. And those aren't the ones that are questionable. Those aren't the ones where we're like, okay, I don't know if I can, apply or not. That one's, it's pretty obvious that we have saturation. We can't go and shouldn't be putting manure out there. But many times it's where, okay, well, where do I get that line of like, well, there's not visible water, but there is some soil that's, it's got a little bit of moisture to it. Where's that? And so, we look at about, using our best judgment. If we go on that field, and we're seeing visible tracks left from our equipment, because we have that moisture in there. That's a sign that, hey, probably that soil is saturated too far. The restriction wise, we look at, what it is, looks like that 2 inches. But really, it's using that judgment. And if you're not sure, All right. If you're not sure as far as, do you consider soil saturated or not, are your local resource and who starts to kind of be the front line when we look at those conditions is our soil and water offices. Our soil and water conservation districts, and obviously the Ohio Department of Ag and help assist that. But many times, and our local counties, our producers, our certified livestock managers can reach out to our soil and water offices, and what do they determine in terms of saturation? Because, like I said, just in the county, you can have an area that had a good amount of rain, and then you go 1, 2, 4 miles away. They had, no visible rain, and they could be doing a whole different application than what the guy that had that 2, 4 inches of rain in a short amount of time. And so, you can't quite say, oh, as you're driving down the road, oh, well, they're applying, their manure for the day. That means I can go out. No, it does have to go and really look at what your soil conditions are. Some things are really obvious when we think about, is it frozen? We're in the middle of summer. We're not quite thinking about this yet. But, I think this was a picture that Glenn had shared, and maybe even from an ODA inspector as well. It's pretty obvious. There's snow on the ground. This ground was frozen, and it was a manure applied to that field. Is that appropriate? Was it worked in? There's things that is pretty obvious. All right. And typically when we think about if the ground is frozen, it probably can't be incorporated. That manure can't be incorporated and worked in. All right. And so that's a kind of a semi kind of good indicator to say, yes, the ground's too frozen to be applying on there. Obviously, with this picture, the ground's able to hold snow and it looks like snow that's been there for a few days. The ground's frozen. We shouldn't be out there and applying in those restricted areas like that. But we have those questions that about those kind of application conditions. We have those questions to where is it a growing crop? What percentage is there? Is the ground saturated? Use your county soil and water conservation districts. They're a local contact. They can usually know kind of what those conditions are in the county, and your best answer is to go to them. you know, Backing up to like you have all these records that we keep, what is the format that we should use? Well, according to the law, there's no required format. There's lots of options that you can utilize. All right, you can go to utilize the form. And the form we have here, you can go to nutrieneducation.osu.edu/record keeping, and you can download a copy of this form, whether you want it in a PDF or you want it in Excel. And then we'll get to some other ones that are listed on that website as well. But these have those requirements that you need to have, all right, that we just talked about, and listing those things down, and that you can record that date at the top. And each time you make an application, the location, the acres, all those things are required. You can use this form if you want, or you can have your own form as long as it meets those record keeping requirements. Some people want to you keep this and be able to do it. So, hey, I don't worry about a notebook that I might lose. All right. And so there is the Ohio Nutrient Management Record Keeper. All right. Thanks to the Knox County Soil and Water Conservation District and the Knox County Farm Bureau, I'd put this app together. I will say if you're an Android user, and I know it might not just have been my new phone, but it's a little difficult to use on my phone in order to actually add an application. But what this does, it also contains all the same required items you need for manure applications, and it actually starts to utilize some other features we'll talk about here. But it's a way that you could keep those records and be able to keep them in an online place. That way, it's that notebook you don't have to worry about losing. You're able to log in and do that. And you can actually keep this. And if you're a business, a farm operation that has lots of applicators, you can put multiple applicators into this as well. We think about this area and especially where we're at and what we have in terms of food, fertilizer and manure application regulations. Mercer County, half of us sit up here into the Western Lake Erie Basin. The other half's we kind of sit into the Grand Lake watershed. And so we have a lot of restrictions that we have for fertilizer manures in these for, obviously with our nitrogen and phosphorus. All right. The fertilizer application restrictions, when can you apply or not? A lot of times we think about this during the winter months, But really, we also have to think, right now as we're getting those good amounts of rain, and we talked about that soil being saturated. If the top 2 inches is saturated, we're not supposed to be going and applying fertilizers, or manure would be considered a fertilizer with a guaranteed analysis that we wouldn't want to be applying that. And then obviously the weather. It plays a really important factor. What is our weather forecast? What is it going to do? All right. If we have a weather forecast that predicts a greater than 50% chance of precipitation, that's going to give us over 1 inch in the next 12 hours, we shouldn't be applying that fertilizer. All right. Or if we are, we have to have some things that the fertilizer can be injected, manure can be injected, incorporated, or it can be applied on a growing crop. All right. We look at specifically manure, it changes a little bit. All right. So from the fertilizer manure, we drop that down. All right. In terms of that 50% chance of precipitation, now we can't have more than 1/2 of an inch in a 24-hour period. All right. So we got to kind of extend what we're looking at. Fertilizer, we're going out, 12 hours. In manure applications, we're going out 24 hours that we can't have more than 1/2 an inch or a greater 50% chance of more than 1/2 an inch in there, unless, again, that manure can be injected into the ground. We have incorporation. It's applied onto a growing crop. Now, one of the questions we get, what's incorporation? What actually is that? Run it over just so quickly. Is that it? You need, again, who's kind of your resources to go to? Ask those questions. If you can, ODA is help to say, okay, what's incorporation? Your local soil and water office can help to do those answers as well, as far as what actually is incorporating, because we've had a few instances that we know about where, what's actually incorporated and what's not. It's, we'll say maybe a difference of opinion. It obviously goes to, when that would have any problems and be inspected, or if it would cause any problems. It's going to be, the Ohio Department of Ag, environmental agencies, and the LEP that we're going to have a little bit later that will kind of go and determine that way wasn't incorporated in that. So work with your soil and waters. That. Now, we do have a couple there at the bottom that we have to think about in terms of manure restrictions. We can have somebody from the Division of Soil and Water that gives a written consent for an emergency application to be made. That can be that difference there. And then obviously, if we are a CLM working with a confined animal operation, we have to make sure we're following what is that criteria we have set and our classifications and the facilities permit. So make sure those are being followed as well. Now, the next kind of question we get usually with record keeping from producers is, well, where do I go for my weather? Like, how do I can talk to 5 weathermen, they each give me a different answer what the percentage is. Well, we've got some resources here, some websites you can go to if you want to go to weather.gov. We talked about that Ohio Nutrient Management record keeping software from the Knox County Soil and Water. That actually has weather records incorporated into it. And then we have the farm. The farm is a fertilizer application resource monitor that's with the Ohio Department of Ag, and OSU goes and puts that together that can actually give you weather conditions. And in fact, it'll give you kind of a red light or green light there, and you can set that. So the first one, weather.gov, it looks like this. You can go there and you put in your zip code, and then it can kind of line you up as, hey, where's my percentages in terms of how likely am I going to get rain? And am I going to hit that 50%? When you put in your zip code, you scroll down to find that hourly forecast. And then you can look there to say, hey, yep, I'm below that, I'm above that, I can't make an application, or I can make an application. Looking at that percentage. And then obviously we can look at that rainfall. If it's, again, fertilizer's 12, manure is 24, and we have to watch how much rainfall we're going to get in that period of time. So that's one place that you can go. Another one that I had mentioned was this field application resource monitor. All right, that would be from partnership of the Ohio Department of Ag and Ohio State that we have. It looks like this when you would go to log in. You can actually just go on and view as a guest, or you can have a profile that you can set up to actually put fields in. All right, and so this is actually our office here that I put in. I marked it the Smith field, but you can outline your field, and you can see there using that application, we have what we said, that red light and green light. You can see for our forecast that we have in the next couple of days, it's a green light for manure, we have a green light for fertilizers, because we don't have a percent chance that's higher than 50 of any kind of rain here in the next 12 or 24 hours, which gives us that red light, green light application for fertilizer and manure. Now, I look at this, and again, that's the weather side, the forecast. If I would walk out right now, our soil's still pretty saturated here. And so, depending on what area you're at, that would limit us in terms of being able to make that application to that field. So, this is just, again, trying to look at, should you make an application based off the weather forecast? And you can utilize this pretty easily to be able to do so. And you can actually go into look, if you don't want to actually put in fields, you can actually go and select what you're looking at, and a map that will show up as far as what our forecast for weather is for the entire state of Ohio. And obviously, if it has a limit, it will put it in red, which the entire state of Ohio, at least right now, was looking good. We don't have a visible rain forecast in the next couple of days here. So, remaining questions that we have, and I mentioned it earlier, how long should we keep our records? All right, we need to keep them for 3 years. We need to keep them that we can go back to them. All right, so if no format that you have to have it in, as long as you have them. So if you have that notebook and you have it, that you put it into the filing cabinet, you put it into the shelf, that, hey, here's all my manure applications, and you keep it for 3 years, that's where you're good. And so you can get rid of those ones that are past the 3-year deadline. If you want to utilize one of the online software programs that many of the offer that we've kind of talked about here, those will keep that in there. And I think several of them keep them kind of indefinitely, which is fine. You can obviously keep records longer than 3 years, but the minimum is that 3-year mark of what we have to follow. All right. And then obviously when you start to look at, you have more questions like, well, I'm not sure about this or that. Our three different kind of organizations here, it's OSU, Soil and Water, and the Ohio Department of Ag. We're the ones that all work together at this. All right. And so if you are that newer producer that maybe you're not yet a licensed fertilizer manure applicator, you can come to your OSU County Extension educator, and we offer those periodically throughout the year. I will say in just the last the week, I did have a couple of poultry producers here in Mercer County that approached that, hey, they need to get the next generation to get their license as they're looking to transition the farm. And so we can help with that side of it to get those people licensed. And you go through a class or you can take an exam to do so. When you start to look at, okay, locally, what does where's the watersheds, or what do we follow? What is actually, do they determine in terms of saturation? That'd be our soil and water offices in our counties that we would go to. And then ultimately, when you have those questions about maybe specific about your license, or you have those questions about permitting, and you have that, we obviously rely on the Ohio Department of Ag. All right. And so that's where we're kind of, sometimes if we're not sure as OSU Extension or Soil and Water, they're going to go and refer to the ultimate authority, which is the Ohio Department of Ag, that gives those answers, and can go to rely those on, and relay that information that you need, or to answer those specific questions, get confirmation about, this is how it should be, this is what would be required, or this is what should be done. All right. And so in terms of exactly when we think about those questions with application, or what you might have with handling any kind of manure or that, especially when we look at from our kind of animal operations. So again, I'm Brian McMichael from Mercer County. Glad to be here to share just some basics on record keeping. And I'm be happy to answer questions, but I know we're going to get the ultimate authority resource, Ohio Department of Ag, with Christine coming up next. So if there is any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
So good morning. I'm Christine Pence. I work in the Ohio Department of Agriculture Division of Livestock Permitting program. I've been an inspector with ODA for about 19 years. and I cover basically the southwest section of the state. If you have any questions during the presentation or need to reach out at any time, my contact information is here. Just wanted to talk a little bit about our program and the areas that we cover. There's 4 inspectors in the state. John Schrader is in the northwest section of the state, and then we have Luke Dahl that kind of piggybacks my area, the southwest section of the state. And then Kat Schauger is no longer with ODA. I think she took a job with the Soil and Water District. So we have a new inspector. His name's Matt Beck, and he basically covers the whole eastern side of the state. Sam Mullins is our chief. Andy Eady is the lead engineer. We have Patrick Bailey as an engineer, and we also have hired a new engineer. His name is Joseph, and he's just getting started. This just basically outlines, shows all of our permitted facilities throughout the state. As you can see, the highest concentration is on the western side. Our responsibilities include enforcing Ohio Revised Code 903, in addition to the Ohio Administrative Code 90110, and any of rules, regulations can be found at our website. Just want to briefly cover those that we regulate. CLMs are certified livestock managers. Each permitted facility in the state has to have at least one person on staff that is responsible for manure management. Anyone that wants to be certified, or if they apply or buy and sell 4,500 dry tons of manure or 25 million gallons, are required to be CLMs. Just talk a little bit about what we do as far as inspections. We typically inspect all of our permitted farms at least once a year. Sometimes they're inspected twice. Our certified livestock managers are also inspected. We review manure application records, structural integrity of manure storage structures in any areas susceptible to surface or groundwater. We also respond to complaints if there are emergencies such as manure spills, fire, mortality events, those sorts of things. We do respond to those. We respond to written complaints, oral complaints, or any other complaints we deem necessary. We do have the authority to require corrective actions and assess administrative or civil penalties against our permitted farms. We also have the ability to do enforcement against our CLMs. And if necessary, we get involved with the Ohio Attorney General's office. I know Ryan covered record keeping, and I just want to piggyback on those just a little bit as we move forward. He talked about maintaining weather records, and I too cannot express enough how important it is to keep records for weather, especially with the types of rainfalls that we've been getting. That weather forecast may call for 30% chance, but ends up we get like 2 inches in 20 minutes. So it's very important to keep those records. Either print them off, you can save them on your computers, you can screenshot on your cell phones, whatever means necessary to save those is very important. Ryan also showed the daily weather forecast and the percent chance. And as you can see from the top black box there, it talks about the 55% chance. And we talked about if there's a 50% chance or greater of a ½ inch or greater rainfall, you should not be applying. The next black box talks a little bit about how to calculate if it's a ½ inch or greater. Obviously, this particular weather forecast, if you add those boxes up, if you are going to think about applying manure within the next 12 hours, if you tally that up, it's a ½ inch. So I would definitely be cautious if you are going to land apply manure without incorporating. This is an example of one of the manure application records that we have provided as an example to our permitted farms and also to our CLMs. Basically, every box should be filled out. The time you start, stop, the source of manure, whether the manure was incorporated, the weather forecast. There's an area where you can include the manure analysis, and you can actually draw a field map if necessary, but many of our folks will actually attach a field map. They may also attach the manure analysis, soil tests, and everything else that is required. This is a good example of a record where they actually dated the days that they applied and how much. Obviously, they applied over a 2-day period. They show their setbacks, their location, the gallons, the acres covered, etc. Another example of a manure application record where they identified the field, the source, the crop, the residue, the forecast. They actually drew on there when they applied. And also they were able to identify all the tile outlets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a scenario where the facility did land application. There was a complaint about manure discharge. An investigation was conducted by me and also included the Division of Natural Resources and Ohio EPA. So scenario is EPA gets a complaint from ODNR. There was an alleged manure discharge from a field. They were automatically blaming the permitted farm. So EPA files a report, notifications go out to the soil and water, and then we end up going out and doing an investigation. We gather all the records from the permitted farm. And as you can see from the timeline, this went on for 12 days. And so manure was applied on May 4th. Then they documented that there was some rain. They did child checks. A couple days go by. Then on May 11th, there's a ½ inch of rain. Now, this is, several days after manure was applied. But then on the 12th of May, they applied manure again. The soil must have been suitable enough to put some manure on, 6,600 gallons per acre. Then on May 14th, they have another 0.2 of rain. Then on May 16th, there's 2 inches of rain that occurred. Then a fish kill was reported. ODNR goes out and does an investigation and determines that the facility caused the discharge. So this did go on for quite some time. We did conduct investigation, but the key here is records were maintained from the start of manure application all the way almost 2 weeks later. So upon investigating the field after the alleged discharge, as you can see, the area along the stream was manure was incorporated or there was tillage done to try to let the manure be absorbed in the soil. The facility maintained thorough records of tile checks throughout the entire process, the time, the date, which tile they checked, the field conditions, who did the tile checks, and even recorded precipitation. Other things to try to basically document what you're doing and when is to take cell phone pictures. Again, check your tile outlets, have a plan in place of what are you going to do if you do have a discharge? And try to just document everything. I did want to just go back and talk a little bit more about this particular incident, I guess, just for future kind of a learning thing. So the manure in that field, the ground conditions were favorable. They recorded all the weather prior to, during, and after. Their records were fairly complete. There was a few things that they could have improved upon, such as they documented when they started to apply manure, but they didn't document when manure application stopped. They did not document the available water capacity, as you can see on this form. So there was a few things that they lacked, all of which come into play later when or if there's an enforcement action. The takeaway here is that they basically did almost everything they could do properly as far as documenting the weather. Field conditions were good. And we were not able to actually find any major violations of ODA rules, even though there was a fish kill documented. But basically the learning lesson here is that they were in good communication with ODA. They had really good records, and accidents can still happen, unfortunately. So moving on, obviously you want to try to take cell phone pictures, check your tile outlets, records, have equipment on hand or available, have good neighbor relations, and other means necessary in case there is a spill or discharge. I'm going to talk a little bit about liability. Who's liable? Who's responsible if a manure spill occurs, whether it's the facility or whether it is who you sold the manure to, who's doing the application. The key here is to have a good plan in place so that people aren't pointing fingers at each other. Here is an example of a manure application record that a facility kept. Very brief. Basically, it says maps are attached. The application rate was documented. Doesn't say whether the manure was incorporated. It says that 160 acres were covered on November 29th. That's basically all that was to that record. This resulted in a complaint, and a significant manure discharge occurred. In fact, this manure application was done over nearly 2 months. So they started in this 160 acre field, and they did not document the days that they applied the manure. And therefore, what happened here was they did do some application on frozen ground, which resulted in a significant manure runoff event. Their records were not complete. They were very vague. And therefore, this actually turned into quite a significant enforcement case. So we talk a little bit about liability. Obviously, we have government statutes, the Clean Water Act, and other laws that allow us to do enforcement. On the private level, there's contracts and civil cases between property owners, and it can be a nuisance complaint, trespassing, that sort of thing. It's very important to have some sort of an agreement or contract between the landowner, the manure applicator, the seller of manure, or whoever. That way we know who's going to be responsible. A lot of the manure applicators want to know, who's going to be in charge of getting the soil tests, who's going to be in charge of inspecting the field during applications, who's going to be responsible for providing manure analysis. So it's very important to have some sort of a contract laid out. And we do see these quite often when we are doing our inspections. Again, clarifying liability, have a checklist, have a contract that's very clear on who's responsible for what. This is not only for your protection, but it's also important for us when we're doing our investigations. Obviously, to minimize liability, you should do your best to follow best management practices, comply with manure management plans that are in place either by the permitted farm or farmer, whoever's involved. Use current standards and also practice good neighbor relations. So, proper timing of manure application where wind's not blowing towards a residence the day before a holiday, just those types of things. We do have the ability to assess penalties, and factors that we consider in considering penalty amounts is the economic impact, basically the size of the livestock operation, whether the facility or responsible party was cooperative. Timeliness is very important. If they were aggressive in trying to clean up the spill or whatever the incident may have been. And also if this is a repeat violation, that comes into play as well. This is something that, we don't really want to see in the news. News articles about facilities that are causing fish kills, not once, but multiple times. And basically, if you have questions, if you need resources for information, we are available at any time. Also, we talked a little bit about recording the weather forecasts. Please remember that you cannot go back to get a weather forecast. You can only get a weather forecast prior to an application event. However, you can go back and get the weather history. So it's very important to maintain those records prior to any sort of manure application. That's all I have. If anyone has any questions.
And with that, we will transition to our last speaker of the morning, Dr. Manbir Rakkar. And your slides look great.
All right, awesome. Great. Good morning, everyone. I am Manbir, and I'm a soil fertility specialist at Ohio State University. I joined Ohio State about 2 years ago, and the number one thing that caught my attention was all the phosphorus questions that we usually deal in Ohio, whether it's water quality issues or related to phosphorus for nutrient management in short. So one of the very first project that I started after joining OSU, it was based on soil phosphorus. So I'm gonna share a little bit about that project. What basically I've been trying to do in these past 2 years is to collect data from different farms which have been undergoing different fertilizer management scenario. How does phosphorus is affected when you use an inorganic fertilizer versus a organic, like manure fertilizer? What happens when we use fertilizer at different rates, maintenance range, buildup range, or just applying even when phosphorus is above critical limits? So those are some of the questions that I've been evaluating. And today specifically, I will be sharing some of the research that's done by my master's students that pertaining to manure application and how that affects soil phosphorus. So let's get into it. In general, at least when it comes down to manure management, as a soils person, it excites us because just giving you an example, I was at a manure expo that happened last week, and there were really cool slogans chosen, written on the shirts. And I went back to, out of curiosity, trying to find out how much times people have quoted soil health in those slogans and how much time that has won that slogan contest. And for sure, there were quotes on soil health. One of them was like, soil health powered by manure. So not just as a researcher or a soils person, I think it keeps coming back over and over again when it comes down to manure and how it affects soil. It's like not all gold smells the same. So it essentially is a kind of a gold when it comes down to as a soil amendment. Just taking some example from the research, just backing up public perception that manure is good for the soil. This is a research that's been done in Nebraska, Lincoln. This study was published about 2 years ago. What they did was comparing how soil is affected when you apply manure versus not apply manure. And this study has been ongoing for about 77 years. This is the study design. I won't go into details, but what essentially is happening, this experiment started in 1912. There was no fertilizer application, but in 1942, they splitted this experiment with this manure versus no manure application. And over the year, this has been modified, but still the integrity of manure versus no manure has been maintained. So what has been the results of this management strategy to soil after about 77 years? When it comes down to soil health, what they found was that manure application improves organic matter, and the difference was about 60% more organic matter in manure plots compared to no manure. Improved available water content, about 7%. And these things are critical, as Ryan was mentioning about that we are getting fewer and fewer available days to work out in the field. These kind of characteristics can really open up that window or extend our working days in the field, because once you have good organic matter conditions or available water holding capacity, that can help you get into the field even when your neighbors can't, if you're applying manure. So that's a good thing with manure application. And then other soil health parameters that we usually talk about, carbon was improved, enzyme activity, ACE proteins, these are very closely related to nutrient management, so those were improved as well. Bottom line, at the end of the day, we are concerned about yield as well. So again, the yield was improved in this experiment. Again, stepping back to our main focus of today, nutrient management. What happened to nutrients in this experiment? One of the nutrients that we are concerned about is nitrogen. And for sure, the manure plots had higher nitrate content compared to no manure. And the differences ranged about 2-3 grams per kg of nitrate amount. What do you think happened with the phosphorus? I'm going to give 1 or 2 seconds, 3 seconds maybe. for you to put that in the chat maybe, or unmute yourself. What happens to the phosphorus levels when you add manure? Any guesses? It increases, right? But what is eye-opening to me, at least, is that in this experiment, phosphorus increased. This is the total phosphorus. When you applied phosphorus, the amount was 271 ppm versus no manure plots. That's a lot of increase, right? If you talk about nitrate, that wasn't that significant, but phosphorus, that's a lot. Malic 3 amounts 300 phosphorus ppm compared to 42. Organic phosphorus, 33 ppm versus 7 ppm. So what I'm trying to emphasize over here is manure is great when it comes down to soil health management or yield stability or even getting nutrients. That is a great source. But when it comes down to phosphorus management, we should be cautious because it affects soils, phosphorus pools significantly. So as a manure is a phosphorus management tool with respect to how you manage it when it comes down to nutrient management. The number one thing to do is the foremost step in nutrient management is you go ahead and soil sample and do that soil testing. Because the number one thing in nutrient management I tend to include in my whole presentation is the importance of soil sampling and testing. If you don't need a particular nutrient, you should be applying that nutrient. For other nutrients like potassium or nitrogen, maybe there are economic losses, but when it comes down to phosphorus, at least in Ohio, we do have economic plus environment quality issues. So we should be really paying attention to what our soil is saying, and then next question comes, do I really need to add that nutrient? For that, we should be referring back to tri-state fertilizer recommendations. Again, for Ohio, the phosphorus recommendations are that we should be applying phosphorus if our critical level, the soil test phosphorus levels are below 20. If it is between 20 to 40, only phosphorus should be applied based on crop removal rates. And if it's above 40 ppm, there is no reason whatsoever to be applying any kind of phosphorus. And that is not only applicable to inorganic fertilizer, but that also applies to manure application. But the problem comes with, or at least from my perception, with manure management is that if we are dealing with inorganic fertilizer and we saw, okay, our phosphorus rates level is 40 ppm, and then what we're going to do, maybe we will just apply urea, and that urea doesn't have any phosphorus, so we are not concerned about phosphorus increment in our soils. However, when we are dealing with manure, even though we don't need phosphorus, but just by the virtue of manure as a capsule of a whole lot of nutrients, intentionally or unintentionally, in those scenarios, we end up applying phosphorus in the systems. How much phosphorus gets into the system with manure? I think that is another question that is problematic when it comes down to utilizing manure as a nutrient management tool compared to an inorganic fertilizer, or a complicated question comes around. The reason for that is because how much phosphorus, for example, in inorganic fertilizer, we know triple superphosphate. It contains about 56% phosphorus. We know it. But when it comes down to manure, how much phosphorus that manure contain, the answer tends down to be, it depends. It's going to depend on what kind of manure we are using. Is it dairy manure? Is it swine manure? How was that manure handled? Is that solid, liquid? All those sort of questions, how that was handled in a facility, how much nutrient losses was there during the storage and handling and transportation. All those questions really end up defining how much phosphorus are there in manure. But there is a really good website that I found that you can get a little hint of how much phosphorus could be in the manure. You can get that information from this ManureDB website. It's hosted at University of Minnesota. A quick summary from their website is that, one, the amount of nutrients over here, there are different total nitrogen, ammonium, phosphorus, and potassium. I won't go too much into details, but what this graph essentially is showing is that nutrient content of different nutrients, nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium, it's really going to depend on what kind of manure you are dealing with. For example, today we are going to talk about phosphorus. If you're using swine or poultry manure, the nutrient content per unit is way higher in swine and poultry manure compared to if it is a beef or dairy manure system. So that's another consideration when you're thinking about nutrient management using manure. So I'm gonna dive deep into a little bit of what I've been observing in our research so far in Ohio. This is the very first site where we collected samples. This is a Hoyt-Wiley soil series, heavy soil, clay loam soil scenario. Over here, we sampled a site that had manure application for over 10 years. The treatments included 12,000 gallon per acre dairy manure, 8,000, and then there was a control treatment, which was not essentially getting any kind of manure. All the nitrogen was getting through the UAN system. So how it affected phosphorus. The number one thing that we looked over was the total phosphorus. How much this total phosphorus contains all kind of pools, available, unavailable, moderately available pools. This is the whole nutshell of how much phosphorus is in the soil. And even after 10 years, the good news is whether you were using 12,000 gallons or all the way to no manure, we did not see any significant differences in total phosphorus due to manure application in this experiment. And then we dive a little deeper into total phosphorus. Total phosphorus is just everything. Most of the time, only a small fraction of phosphorus is usually available to the plants or is at risk to be leached down into the water body. So we dig a little deeper, partition this phosphorus into different fractions, and this is what that graph essentially is showing. Over here, the yellow thing, that is very smaller portion among all other pools in that total P. This, just giving an example, if this is the bar, this is giving you the total organic phosphorus in the soil. The yellow thing, which is not even visible, is what is indicating soluble phosphorus, which is available, readily available to the plants, also is at high risk to be leached down into the water bodies. These blue, green, and red bars are phosphorus that's bound to aluminum, calcium, and iron. It's not readily available, but can be available to the plants or at risk of leaching. And then this purple bar is the reductant phosphorus. This is usually not available to the plants unless things go Wild West. So what we observed in this experiment, total phosphorus didn't change. And even when we looked at different fractions of available versus unavailable pools, in this experiment, there was no effect of different manure management systems, which is again, a good news. Another thing that we are concerned about is the phosphorus saturation levels. This is what this graph is showing. Phosphorus saturation is indicating that how much saturated your soil is. If it's too saturated, addition of any additional phosphorus, it's at high risk of leaching and polluting water bodies. So in Ohio, the threshold level is 11.8%. But coming back to this experiment, again, we did not see any significant differences or crossing that threshold level in this particular experiment. So what essentially it's showing is that dairy manure, even if we were applying for over 10 years in a judicious way, doesn't lead to a whole lot of phosphorus issues, whether it comes down to soil or water quality issues. So there is a chance that we can do manure management in a proper way and not come under the jurisdiction of making phosphorus a problem for Ohio. Switching to another experiment. Now, this is the soil, a silty clay loam, little bit less heavier than the previous site. In this experiment, we were comparing two fields. One was receiving swine manure and another one was not receiving swine manure. It essentially was a nitrogen experiment, so it had high nitrogen and low rates. But what I want to concentrate over here is just this particular treatment of swine versus no manure. All right, so in this experiment, we saw a change, and a huge change. In fact, I want to say that when it was no manure treatments, these blue bars, they were significantly lower compared to the plots that was receiving swine manure. And that changed, just like that experiment I talked about, 77 years, there was a tremendously high amount of phosphorus, almost 3-fold increase in total phosphorus. Caught our eye, okay, we went ahead and tried to parse out what happened to available and unavailable pools. Again, a similar graph of different fractions. This is showing no manure. This is showing manure treatment. Again, we saw a very significant increase, whether it was soluble P or the other pools, almost 10 times higher phosphorus levels. Now, that is a concerning situation here. Then we went ahead and checked over the phosphorus saturation levels, and voila, that did happen. When we increased those phosphorus levels, different pools, that manure plots actually crossed the Ohio's threshold level of 11%, and it was, of course, significantly higher than no manure treatments there. So what is happening with that earlier experiment versus this experiment? I just wanted to put a disclaimer. More or less, this is comparing apples to oranges, and it's a very preliminary data from different management and soil type scenario, but at least to some extent, we can draw some conclusions out of here. I think what's happening in these two experiments is, one, the phosphorus levels ticks up, and that really matters what kind of manure you are using. Dairy versus swine. Swine manure usually contains a whole lot of phosphorus compared to dairy manure. So that should be our key consideration. Another thing that I've been noticing is that at least for swine and poultry manure, we have started using phytase in their diets. What essentially it does is it helps swine and poultry to digest that phosphorus in their stomach. But I think what's happening is now that phytase is also getting excreting out of their systems. And when we add that enzyme into your soil system, that makes phosphorus more available in the soil system as well. So we should be careful about that as well. Application rate matters. That dairy manure was getting about 12,000 gallons per acre. The swine, it is right next to a swine facility. So that field is getting dumped with manure over and over. And last year it was around 23,000. So that's a whole lot of swine manure getting into that field. Soil type might also matter. Clay soils usually have good holding capacity for that phosphorus versus that silty clay loam soil. So that might be what is happening in those two experiments. All right, to wrap up, some key consideration based on the research and just general perception about manure and soils. Manure is great when it comes down to improving soil health and yields. But when it comes down to nutrient management, we should be really paying attention to the nutrient levels that are getting into the systems. We should be applying manure especially important if your phosphorus levels are near that 40 ppm zone. Maybe we need to switch from nitrogen-based rate. We should be applying manure just based on phosphorus, so we are not over applying and building phosphorus levels. If you have high phosphorus soils, the number one thing should be just refrain from applying manure application, or over applying manure application would be key. Again, just wanted to emphasize, I think this is what's happening with the swine manure experiment is just because your field is right next to the barn or a facility doesn't mean you should be dumping manure in that field. That is just not a good idea. And then want to end with this note that if you have extra manure and if your soils are high in phosphorus to start with, maybe you should start considering selling that manure, because at least with inorganic fertilizers, there is high volatility in the fertilizer prices. So maybe there is a room for getting this niche of getting some extra bucks to your farm by selling that manure, rather than creating a problem by dumping it in the soils over and over again. With that, there are some useful websites when it comes down to any kind of nutrient management, manure management, or soil health kind of questions. Those are helpful websites. Again, thank you so much for joining today. Appreciate that. Again, just wanted to acknowledge the funding agency for this research is Ohio Soybean Council. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or email or call me at this given contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manbir. We did have one question come through while you were presenting from Mark Fritz. He's asking, how soon after manure application were the soil tests taken?
So for the dairy manure experiment, this would have been almost a year after. And then for the swine manure, it was swine manure applied in the fall, and then we went in the next spring to sample those experiments. So that would have been the timeline.
Okay, and then there was another one that just came in here. It says, when in a situation where we can sell manure, how do you weigh out the additional risk / labor involved with manure versus synthetic fertilizer? Manure has odor, varying consistency, and more public impact and harder to store.
That's a really good question. Ryan might be able to feel that better than me. These are important consideration for sure. Ryan, you want to weigh in there? You might be better than me.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely, you have to look at what's, what you have the capacity, in terms of storage, and that, and obviously public perception definitely goes in there. It's something. I mean, every situation is different, and so there is the value that manure can get, and I think, Manbir, your point is, just to make sure that you understand there is a value there, and that it can provide us a lot of great nutrients without having to go synthetics, but obviously, and as the question states, I mean, there is that perception, that risk, there's more labor maybe to do that, and maybe some conditions have to be followed. It's every situation is a little bit different, and but there is some programs that are available that actually to encourage the use of manure, in different areas, just because there is some areas that, especially as we think of here in Mercer County, we're highly concentrated with animal operations, and so we have spots where we can apply manure, and so trying to get that to those fields that can utilize that better rather than to continue, as Manbir said, we have to watch our phosphorus limits, and we don't want to, over apply and build up that phosphorus to a point where it is environmentally concerning. So I know it probably doesn't quite answer. It's just every situation is different, but there are folks that willing to accept that, and obviously figuring out and determining that price is different. And I know our farm office team does some a quarterly study looking at the price of manure in terms of what it's going for too. So maybe it doesn't answer the question, but at least some insight there.
Definitely a valuable insight. While we wait for any more questions to come through, we are going to go ahead and transition to our CEUs portion. And another question did just come in. So it says, in follow-up to this, in your discussion around field conditions, when capacity concerns arise, what alternative methods have growers found for alternative solutions to that manure disposal?
I'm sure Water Quality Associates can speak to this too. And some of the others, we're definitely seeing more and more storage facilities for manure go up. And people that are having that in order to get that longer capacity of longer storage, especially, and obviously it's a requirement when you look at the large operations that have that need to be able to store it for longer. But even before they get to the permitting size, we're seeing folks put up manure storage and utilizing some programs in order to do that. And so that's the methods in terms of solutions, in terms of not so much disposal, but in terms of just being able to store it longer and before the conditions do allow it to go on. And obviously there is some research out there that's happening in terms of how to maybe to utilize and to take some of that phosphorus and do there. It's still developing in terms of research. I know locally on our county, Teresa Dirksen has done some work with some companies as far as utilizing and that. And I can't think of the name of the companies that have done some work as far as to come up with some different ways to utilize manure and take out the phosphorus level or to use that then make it into a fertilizer. But that hopefully answers a little bit of the question there.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing over here. At least from the soils perspective, if you are showing that if your soils are showing that phosphorus levels are building up, you should be cautious right there. The problem is you can probably easily build a soil phosphorus level, but once they are at high phosphorus limits, it's very hard to draw back that phosphorus levels. There are strategies, but they are not super effective. So it's not good to get into that limelight. So that's one thing to be really considerate when it comes down to manure and keeping that phosphorus levels under that threshold level. Regarding the manure disposal, I don't know how big of an industry it is at the moment, but things are picking up with the biochar. There's a lot of interest among industry people who are involved with biochar production. They are utilizing manure as a tool to produce biochar. So that might be another thing that can be explored. There's a good market for that.
Christine, I saw you were unmuted there for a little bit. Do you have anything to add?
Just going to say, if storage issues are an issue or a concern, that solid manure can be stockpiled. So if they're running out of storage, out of facility and need to move solid manure, and they have intended land application sites, that the solids can be transported and stockpiled so that they can be land applied when field conditions are suitable. As far as liquid storage structures go, they too have an option to maybe search other facilities that are nearby that they could maybe transport some manure to other liquid storage structures. that might have additional storage capacity. We do work with facilities that if the ground is frozen, we may be able to provide emergency land application approval. However, for permitted farms, there are pretty strict things that they have to do ahead of time to plan for that. The crop residue, ask for permission. There are additional setbacks. There is a maximum application rate that has to be thoroughly reviewed prior to giving approval. Also, we do have some facilities with liquid storage that may be able to transport manure to wastewater treatment plants or other places that have additional storage. I guess the biggest thing is pre-planning in the fall to make sure they have enough storage to get through spring. I hope that helps answer question.
And I'll just add it, as Christine said, I mean, the dry is easy because you get the storage, but the liquid, we're seeing producers that are looking at equipment that will allow them to apply into growing, cornfields and to be able to use that. And not just we're talking about drag hosing is becoming the last 10-15 years, but even then utilizing some other irrigating equipment that will allow them to land apply during the growing season, and doing that with some specialized equipment. So we're seeing some producers that are looking at those and investing in those, because again, trying to find when they're able to do that, and when soil conditions are right and weather forecaster could, it can be difficult for a producer. It just takes some management and some pre-planning, as what Christine said.
Yep, exactly. And I want to thank our attendees for the great dialogue today. This has been really good, and our speakers as well for their time this morning. So with that, we're going to wrap up today's webinar. We hope that you will join us again in October for our next webinar of the series. And in the meantime, if you have any questions for our team, our email is up here on the screen. Our website link is there as well. And all of these webinars are recorded and are posted to the OSU Agronomy YouTube channel for later viewing, although they do not offer CEUs. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up.